Good morning, my dear pupils. Today we're going to talk about realistic story or fanciful story. A realistic story tells us about something that can happen in real life. It tells us of everyday happenings, everything, the things that we do every day. Examples of realistic story: the life of Osirisal, the coronavirus pandemic, the life of Saint Nicholas of Tolentino. As you can see, a realistic story is a real happening. Life of a hero, of a saint, and things that happen in the past and in the present. While a fanciful or imaginary story is a make-believe story that could never happen in real life. Fanciful or imaginary story, it is strange and magical. Examples are stories about giants, dwarves, animals that talk, fairies, and witches. Sounds familiar, right? Examples of fanciful or imaginary story are Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Moana, another example of fanciful or imaginary story, Spider-Man, Lion King, and this one, Pikachu in Pokemon. So, let's try this. Read each sentence and determine whether it is realistic or fanciful. The garden is filled with different vegetable plants. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? The correct answer is a realistic story. Next, a tomato plant said hello to me. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? The answer is a fanciful story. The wind sang a song for the rose. Is it a realistic story or fanciful story? The correct answer is a fanciful story. The rain fell gently on the plants. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? The correct answer is a realistic story. A strong wind blew off the leaves of the mango tree. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? The correct answer is a realistic story. The moon lighted her lamp and the flowers danced. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? The correct answer is a fanciful story. The sun shone brightly on the garden plants. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? The correct answer is a realistic story. The hot sun turned the cabbage leaves down. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? The correct answer is a realistic story. When the rain fell, the flowers clapped their hands. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? The correct answer is a fanciful story. When evening came, the plants said goodnight. Is it a realistic story or a fanciful story? It is a fanciful story. Great job, my dear pupils. Now you already master the skill of identifying a realistic story from a fanciful story. See you online.